welcome to the Rumi Forum. We're delighted that you all could join us this afternoon. We have with us today a very special guest, a very esteemed conflict resolution professional. J. Alexander Thier is the director for the Afghanistan and Pakistan Project of the U.S. Institute of Peace and chair of the Institute's Afghan and Pakistan working groups. There he leads the USIP efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where he has lived and worked on and off since 1993. He's the co-author and the editor of The Future of Afghanistan, which is a USIP publication, 2009. And he was a member of the Afghanistan Study Group, co-chaired by General James Jones and Ambassador Tom Pickering. He apparently authored the final report, and is a member of the Pakistan Policy Working Group and co-author of its 2008 report, The Next Chapter, the U.S. and Pakistan. He's been with the U.S. Institute for Peace since 2005, when he joined as senior advisor in the Rule of Law Center of Innovation. He's built up the Institute's rule of law programming in Afghanistan, and including its pioneering work in establishing relations between the Afghanistan state and non-state judicial systems. He was the director of the Project on Constitutional Making, Peace Building, and National Reconciliation, and the expert group lead for the Genocide Prevention Task Force. He has a very long, illustrious bio, and he's told me he doesn't want me to sit here and go through it in too much depth. But I encourage you to go to the Rumi Forum website so that you can read it online, and also probably the USIP website. We're delighted that he's here to talk to us on the recent Afghan elections and the rumors or mumblings of fraud in the Afghan elections, and particularly with a view toward whether or not we are properly analyzing the transparency and auditability and verifiability of the elections over there in a way that should satisfy us that the elections have integrity. So if you could just address first of all, how you got to Afghanistan. And this sort of tells us briefly of your professional trajectory toward Pakistan and Afghanistan. And if you could just sort of let us know, what led you over there, and then what you were doing briefly there, and then with a specific focus and emphasis on whether or not the elections, in your view, were consonant with our notions of rule of law.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm particularly pleased. Of course, Rumi is a poet that any Afghan school child, if you ask them, can often cite verse. I'm amazed, in fact, at how people, not only Afghans, but people in the region, can cite poetry, and do at almost any occasion and event. And I'll come to how I got to Afghanistan in a minute, but I think that the first thing that I want to say is that as we have the world and the United States government, the Congress focusing on Afghanistan, it is almost exclusively a bad news story in our mind. Everything is about concern about violence and terrorism, but of course Afghanistan has a very long history. And I think it's very important for people to have a context of Afghanistan in the region, because Afghanistan is not just, as one congresswoman, who I won't name, said in a hearing the other day, that she had visited Afghanistan and she thought it was a hellhole. And in fact, Afghanistan has an amazing history. It has a history of arts and culture. And even living to this day, it has a history. It's a country of roughly 25 million people, most of whom any of us would be lucky to have a relationship with. And so it's very important when we talk about these issues of war and peace and what should be done to realize that Afghanistan is not some horrible, God-forsaken place. It's a wonderful country with a long history, and eventually they will come out of this phase with or without our help. And I do believe that Afghanistan's interests and our interests are closely intertwined, and that it's very important for us to have positive engagement with Afghanistan. But I think that the way that the country and the people get characterized in the media can be very problematic to a positive understanding. I ended up going to Afghanistan in 1993. Unfortunately, at the time, the Soviets had pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989, And it was in the early 90s that we thought that the hopes for post-conflict reconstruction in Afghanistan were real, that after this horrific decade plus of conflict that Afghanistan had experienced with the Soviet invasion, that it was going to be a time for renewal and that the international community would come together and help Afghanistan recover. Unfortunately, as we all know, that's not the case. I made plans to go to Afghanistan to work for the United Nations in 1992. I ended up getting there in early 1993, and between the time when I planned to go and when I arrived, the Civil War broke out. And as we know, Afghanistan then spent the next several years in this terrible, after the Soviet war, in this terrible civil war, which was very damaging to the fabric of the country. It became an ethnic conflict, whereas the Soviet conflict had not been. It became an Afghan conflict, whereas again, you know, of course there had been Afghans involved in the Soviet war on the side of the government and the Soviets, but for the most part, it wasn't a war that tore the domestic fabric, because most Afghans were opposed to the Soviet occupation. But when the Civil War happened, the country divided up into all of these different warring fiefdoms, and it became a much deeper problem for the Afghans. And the reason it's very important to understand that period in how it affects us today is really two things. The first is that the conflict that happened in Afghanistan during the 1990s isn't over. There was a civil war that basically got pushed aside by the arrival of the Taliban, and a lot of those tensions between the different regions of Afghanistan and the ethnic tensions, they're still very present, and there hasn't been an effective way to deal with them. One of the things that we at the U.S. Institute of Peace focus a lot on is how do you deal with societal reconciliation after conflict. And one of the ways that you deal with that, of course, is to acknowledge the conflict, is to acknowledge the damage that the conflict caused, the abuses that happened, and to deal with them. And that hasn't happened at all in Afghanistan. And so there's this lingering element of the conflict. The second reason it's so important to understand what happened in the 1990s as it affects today and the decisions that are being made today in Afghanistan and the insurgency is that when the Civil War broke out and the country became so chaotic, and the lack of law and order, the lack of rule of law, the corruption, the despotism of the warlords that we've all heard so much about, was so dramatic that when the Taliban came on the scene, many people associate the Taliban with this sort of religious leadership, this religious movement. But in fact, what attracted Afghans to the Taliban was not anything about religion, it was about law and order. The Taliban were essentially a law and order movement. And when they swept aside these commanders and warlords, what they put in place was a very rough form of justice, but it was justice. It was law and order. And in any society, Western society, Eastern society, people will always choose law and order over chaos. And what the Taliban offered was stability. And people appreciated the Taliban because of the stability that they offered. Now, that's not true all over the country because there were ethnic tensions, but still, the success of the Taliban very much depended on the stability that they brought in the areas that they conquered. And so one of the things that we're seeing today is that the reason that the Taliban are succeeding is not because they have some winning ideology or that the vast majority of Afghans, even in the provinces where they are strongest, support them. It's because the Afghan government and those associated with the Afghan government, the warlords, are so problematic. They're either weak and they haven't provided security and justice to the people, or because they are in fact bad and they provide insecurity to the people and they are corrupt. And so one of the main reasons that we're in the place we are today in 2009 with the level of instability, the strength of the insurgency, is in fact for these same reasons. Because the Afghan government, together with its international partners, have not offered a strong enough, a viable enough, and a credible enough alternative to the Afghan people. And so that leads us then to a discussion of the election. everybody who was paying attention, say 9 months ago, as this election process began to unfold, knew that there would be serious problems with the election. First of all, you have massive insecurity in parts of the country, which makes it, A, very difficult for people to vote safely, for people to campaign safely, for the logistics of the election to reach all of these different corners and to get ballots out to these areas and to open polling stations. And so that's an enormous problem, this question of security. It also makes it difficult to monitor the election. If you have an area that's insecure, it's much easier to commit fraud because there's no one there who's able to monitor the process, or it's much more difficult to do so. So security was going to be a problem. At the same time, there had been fraud in the elections in 2004 and 2005. Now, these were relatively good elections, and the outcome was good enough that a lot of people accepted it. But this election was quite different from the previous election. First, this election was being done not by the international community, but by the Afghans. And so you had capacity issues about whether the Afghans had the ability to carry out the elections, but you also had political issues about whether the Independent Election Commission, for instance, was in fact independent. Was it a tool of the government that appointed them, or were they going to be independent? So that was another concern that people raised. And then the final concern that came up, which grew as the election got closer, was that President Karzai believed that he had the election in the bag, that he was going to win the election. But two things happened. One, there were some signals that maybe the Americans were not completely backing Karzai in this election, or at least that they were neutral. At the same time, you had a candidate, Dr. Abdullah, who was Karzai's former foreign minister, who started to gain some traction. He was campaigning and started to attract large crowds in different parts of the country. And the people around Karzai got nervous that maybe the election wasn't in the bag. Now, even if they thought he would be the first candidate, the Afghan election system as a presidential system requires that the winner get more than 50% of the vote. And there were some polls that came out in the months before the election that indicated that President Karzai did not have 50% support. He was the leader, but he didn't have 50% support. And so it became increasingly possible that he would go into a runoff election against the number 2, which looked like it was going to be Dr. Abdullah. And I think that the Karzai people were very nervous that if he went into a runoff election, it would demonstrate that he was weak. It might demonstrate that he didn't have international support, and therefore that he could potentially lose in a runoff election, or that he would be weakened and his stature would be weakened. And what I think happened is that some plans for fixing of the election got panicked at the end, and that people who wanted President Karzai to win probably went a little bit overboard. One of the things you have to understand about the Afghan system, because it's a highly centralized government, is that President Karzai appoints everybody. The local police, the local district governors, the local ministry officials, they're all appointed by the center. There is no de-evolution of political authority, even though in reality Afghanistan is one of the most highly devolved societies on the planet. And so the problem that you have is that every sort of guy at the district level owes his job to Karzai. And so it doesn't have to be that Karzai came up with some central scheme for all of the fraud, but all of these people understood that if Karzai didn't win, they could be out of a job. But they weren't very good at it. The fraud was very clumsy. And so what happened is that you had this election, and 3 things happened. First, turnout was very low. Voter turnout in the 2004 election was around 70%. It looks like voter turnout in this election may have been as low as 30%. So because of insecurity, because of apathy, voter turnout is bad. It's especially bad, of course, in the very insecure areas of the country. One thing that we've learned in recent days, for instance, is that people who were tracking the number of voters going to the polls versus the number of votes reported demonstrate in some of the most dangerous provinces that it may be as many as 10 times the number of people, of votes in the ballot boxes as observers believe actually went to the polls. You had a huge problem of polling stations returning ballot boxes full of votes that never opened. So this first thing that happened is that the turnout was quite bad. The second thing that happened was that there was real, concrete, and obvious evidence of fraud. There is an Electoral Complaints Commission in Afghanistan that is a joint international Afghan body. It's created under Afghan law. It has 5 commissioners. 3 of them are international, and 2 of them are Afghan. And they have responsibility for judging any complaints that come in to the electoral process. They immediately received a flood of complaints right after the election, several thousand complaints. And when they reviewed these complaints, they realized that perhaps 700-800 of them were so serious that they could potentially, when added up, affect the outcome of the election. And so they went to 3 provinces where there were a lot of complaints, and they started opening ballot boxes and saying, okay, we have to see what's going on here. And they found really gross and obvious evidence of fraud. They found ballot boxes where, so you imagine a ballot box, it's a plastic box with a cover and a slit on it. In order to get the vote in, you have to fold it up at least twice, stick it in the box. And they found boxes full of ballots that had never been folded. They found boxes with ballots where all the votes were for one candidate and with the identical pen and the identical check mark. Videos emerged on YouTube. You can see these if you type Afghan election fraud into YouTube. Videos emerged on YouTube of men surrounded by ballot boxes, taking books of ballots, flipping them over, marking them, flipping over them, marking them. They found some ballot boxes that actually had the ballot book in without the ballots having even been torn out. And when they added this all up, well, and then the most obvious widespread signs were that we knew that each ballot box essentially was signed 600 votes, because the registration process in Afghanistan does not assign voters to a specific poll. So they had to estimate that a maximum of 600 voters could show up at each poll, even if they knew that it would likely only be 200. What happened? They start counting all of these boxes in places where you had 10, 20, 30% turnout. All of the boxes had 600 votes, 595 votes, 605 votes. So we knew turnout was low, but turnout was at 100% levels. At the same time, you'd count, and 95, 96, 98, 100% of the votes were all for one candidate. And these sorts of things only happen in Saddam Hussein's Iraq and in the Soviet Union, where the voter turnout is sort of 99% in favor of one candidate. And so because of all of these signs of fraud, they decided that they had to do a nationwide investigation. And so they established 2 criteria. One was that any ballot box with 600 or more votes had to be examined, and any ballot box where 95% or more of the votes were for one candidate had to be examined. And establishing these 2 criteria, they turned up about 4,000 out of 25,000 polling stations. But the number of votes is even higher than the percentage of those polling stations would suggest, because so many of them had 600 votes. It turns out to be anywhere between 25 and 30% of the total vote having to be re-examined. Now, so you have this political crisis where everybody's saying there's massive fraud, The election commission, the independent election commission, is posting totals that show Karzai winning because they included a lot of these bad votes. And you have this process where you have to examine ballots from 34 different provinces. So the Electoral Complaints Commission decides that it's going to do a statistical sample of this problem group of votes. And they're going to examine only 10% of the problem group. And they're going to look at seeing how bad the fraud is from all of these different, and then from there they're going to extrapolate and figure out what the total is. And so we are now engaged in that process. They are opening up boxes from 34 provinces and reviewing the votes. And basically, President Karzai would need to lose somewhere probably between 500 and 700. Well, in total, there would need to be somewhere between 500 and 700,000 votes rejected in order for a runoff to be called. But the danger is that if you reject 500,000 votes and President Karzai ends up with 50.3%, and is therefore, according to the election rules, the winner, you have this terrible situation where the president, you had massive fraud committed, almost all of it, 80%, 90% on behalf of the president, and yet he's going to be declared the winner of the election. And I think that from a standpoint of political legitimacy, it creates an untenable situation. So now we're in this bind. In probably the most important year for Afghanistan since 2001, the whole international community is debating what to do about Afghanistan. Everybody's already complaining about corruption in the Afghan government and the problems of the legitimacy of the government and the strength of the insurgency. And right in the middle of this, as the White House is sitting deliberating about whether to send troops, whether to cut back, what to do, you have this election crisis plop right in the middle at the worst possible moment.
That's a pretty good but disturbing summary. And I do have I have a question that relates to what happened in the past and then to take us to the future. In the 2004 election, you said there was also election fraud, right? Was it of the same genre? Was it of the same sort of ballot box stuffing and just guys writing ballots for, was it the same type of fraud or was it a different kind of was there any sort of electronic black box or central tabulator issues, you know, in that election, or was it all just sort of elementary, primitive ballot box stuffing stuff?
Yeah, it was more of the same on a much lesser scale, and the big difference that you have now is that in 2004 and 2005 the elections were run by the UN. So you didn't have this problem that the central body that's responsible for the elections may be biased in favor of one candidate. You didn't have that problem then. So you both have much larger fraud issues at the local level, at the ballot box level this time around, and you also have this national problem where the authorities who are responsible for the fair and free conduct of the election may also have bias issues.
Okay, so what happens next if we determine that substantial enough fraud happened that they have to do a runoff or a re-election or whatever? Can that be done in any way that would guarantee that the next one wouldn't be the same mess? I mean, what should be done from an international perspective or from our intervention that would create a more secure election environment?
Yeah. It's a very good question because if there is a runoff called, there's a very high pressure situation. Because Afghanistan is such a mountainous country, you really can't conduct elections after the end of October, beginning of November, because it will disenfranchise a significant portion of the population because it's very hard to get everything out there due to snow. So there will be enormous pressure to conduct the election very quickly. If they can. If they can't and end up postponing it to the spring, that's a whole other problem because President Karzai, I didn't bring this up before, as you may recall from the spring, his term ended, according to the Constitution, in May of this year. And so there was a big debate, can Karzai continue in office? Should there be an interim government? And everybody, because the elections were set for August, everybody accepted the outcome. Okay, we'll give him a few more months. We won't turn this into a national crisis. But they won't stand by, particularly after this fraud issue, for Karzai to sit in the palace for another 6 months while we wait for the snow to melt. So you have another type of crisis on your hands if we can't do the runoff before spring, which is who should head the government and how do you make that decision. But if you do hold it, it's going to be like a 2-week turnaround. And so getting the security and the logistics in place, let alone figuring out a better way to deal with fraud issues, is going to be extremely challenging. I believe that we can make this round better than the last round. First of all, it would only be an election between 2 people. It's not going to have the provincial council elections as well. You had 38 others on the ballot for president. And so it's much easier to have agents of the candidates in more places to increase the monitoring. There was a very good effort by Afghan civil society organizations. I think that we could increase their presence as well quite quickly. You can do relatively quick trainings to teach people how to do poll monitoring. I think that we could use creative ways to do what's called parallel vote tabulation, where you have someone outside the polls watching the number of voters go in. So then when they say in the end, we had, 700 people vote here, and somebody standing outside says, I only counted 200 people going into the station. There are, I think, creative ways in which you could deal with some of these things. It's still going to be spot checking. You're not going to be able to be everywhere. But we also have the advantage of knowing where the worst fraud occurred. So clearly, you got to get rid of the bad officials. I mean, for every single ballot box that they throw out, or even those that are suspect, you got to remove the guy who was running that polling station. And even if it's, I'm not saying prosecute him because that's difficult, but at least just get him out of there because that's one step that you can take. So you're not going to make it perfect, but I think that you could probably make it, better enough so that it would be a much more legitimate outcome in the second round.
And so how many polling stations are there?
Well,
I mean, if the Carter Center were going to go over and have monitors hit every station, how many would there be?
There are polling centers and polling stations. There were scheduled to be about 7,000 polling centers, and within those about 25,000 polling stations. So you're really, because like often I think in ours, you have a ballot box in one room, a ballot box in another room. They're counted as separate stations, but it's one location. It'll be one school, and there'll be 3 different polling stations. So in reality, you're only talking about, maybe 6,000 to 7,000 physical locations. One of the big problems, though, was that some of these locations were in places that were simply too dangerous to open. And so there's probably about 1,000 of those that you need to think seriously, where can we put these so that they're going to be, that they'll open and that people will be able to go out and vote.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the audience to see if they have any questions. If you could please state your name and any affiliation that you'd like to represent.
Sure, David Blum. I'm just wondering, could you actually inform us of what would actually happen if it were to be possible that Dr. Abdullah were to win either another election or a runoff? What would be the outcome of that from American foreign policy or Afghanistan domestic policy?
Your question raises a very interesting issue, and I will address it directly, but it raises this bigger issue about holding elections in Afghanistan, period. And part of the reason I raise that is that apart from the corruption issue and concerns about whether we can get President Karzai to focus seriously on corruption, there is no great substantive difference between where President Karzai stands and where Dr. Abdullah stands on major issues. There are some minor issues which I think are much more interesting domestically for Afghans than internationally. One of those, for instance, is that Abdullah, in part probably because his mother is a Tajik, his father is a Pashtun, but he's much more identified with the Tajiks and particularly the Panjshiri Tajiks. And Afghanistan is a plurality state. There's no ethnic group that's a majority, but the Pashtuns have typically and almost exclusively ruled the country. And as a result of that, in part, a lot of the other major ethnic groups are much more interested in political arrangements that would allow for greater power sharing. So that is at the national level, they would prefer, for instance, a parliamentary system instead of a presidential system to allow for greater sort of representation, proportional representation. And they would prefer for, I wouldn't call it a federal system, but they would prefer a more decentralized system that could have elements of what is often referred to as federalism. For instance, one of Abdullah's proposals is to have the governors elected. Typically, not typically, always, Afghanistan's governors are appointed, and interestingly, the appointed governor is almost never from the province to which he is appointed. That's an old sort of strategy which has to do with having people who aren't from the area so that they're neutral, and also a means that the king can control what goes on. But so there are some proposals about sort of the domestic political structure of Afghanistan that Abdullah might actually pursue differently than Karzai. But on the international side, as far as the counterinsurgency effort and so on, they're fairly well aligned. They're both generally supportive of the idea of reconciliation with insurgent groups. Again, they might handle it differently. I think that the big difference is that, in any political culture, whether it's the United States or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia might be a bad example of this, although, any ruler after a significant period of time starts to look bad. They all make mistakes, they all do things that are unpopular, they run out of fresh ideas. Hamid Karzai has essentially been president for almost 8 years of Afghanistan during an extremely challenging time. And I think that for Afghan appreciation of the power of what democratic governance means, as well as for getting Afghanistan out of a rut. I mean, the last 3 years have been a terrible retrograde movement for Afghanistan, that fresh leadership is really needed. Now, that's not to say that it can't be Karzai with a new team and maybe a new person in a sort of prime ministerial position. But I think one of the differences that Abdullah could make, and he'll have a lot of faults as well, is bringing a fresh team and a fresh perspective to a series of problems that have obviously confounded the current government.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
My name is Suleiman Wasti. I'm from the Planning Commission of Pakistan. Looking forward, beyond the elections, you mentioned Afghanistan being a plurality and devolved and everything else. But the reality is that you have 40 million Pashtuns if you cross the Durand line, which is the largest ethnic population without a doubt. Compared to the Kurdish population, it's only 17 million. And I'm not including the 40 million, the diaspora, which runs the traffic from Karachi to Islamabad and others. And that, to me, is something to ponder over. I was talking to a friend of mine, Ashraf Ghani, and he basically said Afghanistan is just limited to Kabul. The elections will be decided in Kabul, and then what happened around all these other provinces were ethnic lines. So to expect an election, even if the fairest elections were held, I don't know what the expectation would have been. So I'm just making a comment, and I thank you for your insights.
We'll let him address that first, and then we'll get back to
Well, it wasn't so much of a question,
as a comment. Okay,
yeah.
let's take the next one then.
My name is Sonai Kambar. I'm with a law firm in DC, as Zaltzman Evinch. At the end of your speech, you talked about some ways of improving ballot monitoring. You talked about parallel vote tabulation, for instance. But under the current circumstances, when the system is still very much centralized, how could we achieve better results with ballot monitoring, for instance, if considering that the people, the Afghans who monitor the ballots, are also appointed by Karzai directly? In that case, I think we would need foreign ballot monitors in Afghanistan, which could also increase the resistance to foreign people participating and monitoring their elections, because there's already this foreign nationalism there. What are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
I mean, you can't do it with internationals. You require too many. It's too unsafe. People don't speak the language. But the good side of, again, we focus on the bad on Afghanistan, and I understand why, but there are some really good sides of the story of Afghanistan over the last 8 years. As someone who lived in Afghanistan during the Civil War in the 90s, I can tell you it can get a lot worse. And some great things have actually been done in the last couple of years in Afghanistan. Two of those things which are very relevant to your question. One is media. There has been a tremendous explosion of media in Afghanistan. The problem with media in Afghanistan is not state control, although they do try, but in some ways it's almost not lack of state control, but lack of standards. When you have an explosion like that, you have a lot of people out there not trained as journalists and so on, and that can be dangerous. But it's mostly a good story. I mean, Afghans have tremendous access to radio, first and foremost, because almost every Afghan listens to the radio. That's where they get their news, and obviously it's completely literacy foolproof, because everybody can, almost everybody can hear the radio, and they're avid radio listeners. There's been an explosion of television. There's a lot of print media, particularly in some of the major cities. There's diversity of voices. And that has been actually really important for this political process over the last couple months. We had the first ever presidential debate in Afghanistan. The sitting president showed up for that debate. It was, of course, broadcast on radio and television. And so there have been some real advances. And more broadly in Afghan civil society. I think I mentioned, I don't remember the exact number, but there was something like 5,000 Afghan civil society monitors who participated in the first round of elections. You have a lot of organizations that have grown on their own, that have received international funding. And so, there really is some good news story in there, that Afghan society and Afghans are growing in their capacity and potential to police their own government. And ultimately, that's the only way it's going to work. I mean, one thing that I don't think I've emphasized enough, but if I've got any soapbox preaching thing that's necessary for Afghanistan, it's that, we can't do it for them. None of these things, the governance piece, the elections piece, the security piece, I mean, ultimately, these things have to be led by Afghans. And it's not just some touchy-feely way of talking about development. It's pragmatically, you can't run somebody else's country. No matter how good you are, it'll never work. And ultimately, unless they try and fail and then eventually, hopefully, try and succeed, they're not going to be able to become the owners of their own future. And so one of the things that concerns me about the current debate in Afghanistan, and whether we add more troops and civilians and so on, is that we start to lose sight of the fact that the more we put into Afghanistan, the harder it becomes for the Afghans to be in control of their own destiny. And it's a balancing thing. I'm not saying pull out or do nothing, because I do believe we need to commit more, but you need to do it with a level of awareness that makes you understand that ultimately this is the Afghans are going to have to live or die by this fight. And we ultimately we can't do it for them.
I just have one other question, and if anybody else has any others, I'll just take those. But from your perspective, would we be better served if the second candidate replaced Karzai? Are we so unhappy with Karzai that it's sort of in, anything but Karzai scenario from our perspective, or what would your view be?
We are best served with a legitimate government. I don't believe that can't be Karzai and it has to be Abdullah, but it certainly can't be Karzai under the cloud of this election. There needs to be something that's going to follow this, whether it's a runoff election that gives people greater confidence in the process, or some kind of other political agreement that creates a national unity government and distributes power. I don't believe that the status quo, if we can call it that, which is that Karzai comes out of this election, let's say next Thursday there's an announcement and Karzai has won 50.5% of the vote after all is said and done. Let's close the books and move on for the next 5 years. I don't know I don't think the story can end there. There needs to be something else as part of the political process, whether it's an Afghan Loya Jirga or something that's going to happen that will recommit the political elites to the legitimacy of the government.
Okay, and then just a second follow-up. What next has to happen before the judiciary that exists now would declare this election to be invalid?
The judiciary is not supposed to have a role in the election. It's of course always possible, as we've seen in our own country, that you could end up somehow getting this into the judiciary, but the way the system has been established with the Independent Elections Commission and the Electoral Complaints Commission, they are supposed to be the final unappealable certifiers of the election. And so I don't anticipate that it will go into the judiciary. It's possible, but then that raises a whole other series of concerns, because frankly, Afghanistan's judiciary does not have the level of legitimacy to be in the position to be deciding the election either.
Okay. Right here.
My name is William Bache. I'm a consultant in Kabul. I just came from there a few days ago. My sort of feeling is the elections are really for the West. And when you have a government that only controls Kabul and those other 34 provinces, or they don't get a chance to appeal their corrupted elections. And I see the Afghan elites with Karzai so selfishly only interested in their self-interest and their extended families or tribes. I'm not very hopeful for the situation there. I believe that they have to own the country and want to win, or want to deliver to their people. I know the police, of the 700 guys that have graduated from the German police academy, none have ever been assigned outside of Kabul. So, I don't see the desire on their part to do what we think they ought to do. I don't see the military and police working together. I'm pessimistic, and I just wonder if, is elections really that important? I don't think there's a military capacity for a coup with an Ataturk type solution, that united that country, a military dictatorship. So, and in the area of justice, seems like the Taliban again is the people that administer justice, with all their shadow governments at district and province level. And that's where the people are going, because if they go to the Kabul government, they have to pay somebody off. That's justice.
Yeah, I think that you're right. The leadership, political will, whatever you want to call it, is the essential missing ingredient. And I think that that's why, we are on a dangerous path. I mean, I do believe that the worst possible scenario for the United States is to have us with 100,000 international forces in Afghanistan, maybe 120 or 140 after President Obama's decision, while the legitimacy of the government continues to decline, and we appear to be propping up a corrupt and illegitimate government. That really is the worst case scenario. And if you believe that, as I do, then I think you have to work backward from there and say that the current situation is unacceptable, and that steps need to be taken to encourage and or force certain steps on the part of the Afghan government to improve their legitimacy. The problem with elections, I've had this argument in an ongoing way with friends of mine who are sort of in the elections community. And the problem is that the Americans and the United Nations can never be the ones to say, no, we don't think you should hold elections. We can't say that. And so it's always then left to this local decision making, or what often happens is that we've come to some sort of agreement. So in this case, it was the Bonn Agreement, Afghans with international sort of pressure, the Constitution, Afghans with international pressure, the London Compact, Afghans with international pressure, that continue to state over and over again these objectives. There has to be a democratic government, there'll be elections, accountability, and so on. And unfortunately, the only thing that's scheduled in all of that, so you've got anti-corruption, accountability, and elections, the only thing that's scheduled are the elections. So if you fail to put the accountability and the institutions in place, no one's going to say, uh-oh, it's 2009, we have to have accountability this year. But they will say, uh-oh, it's 2009, we have to have elections this year. And you end up in a situation like we ended up with, I think, this winter and spring in Afghanistan, where there were a lot of people in the international community who really would have liked to have postponed the elections this year. And I think from a pragmatic perspective, it might have been a good idea with the insecurity and the fact that Afghanistan and the presidential and the parliamentary elections are not held at the same time. They should be held at the same time for economic and all other sorts of reasons. And so there was kind of some discussion, why don't we postpone the presidential election at least until next year? Hopefully the situation will be better, and then we can save some money. And what happens, of course, is that all of the opposition to Karzai stands up and say, we have a constitution here, and it says Karzai will no longer be legitimate leader in May of 2009. Is the international community that basically stood over us and made us agree to this constitution now saying that we shouldn't follow it and that Karzai should continue as the leader, even though there are other aspirants to this democracy that you've forced upon us? It's a really, really difficult position to be in. And ultimately, I think we end up saying, well, we can't stand against the principle of elections and democracy, so we'll hold elections even though we know that the systems of accountability, the institutions that are needed to create real democracy, are not there. We've had this horrible oversimplification of democracy. Elections are not democracy. Elections can be anti-democratic if you don't have the proper institutions and rule of law in place to embed those elections in. But ultimately, if you don't hold elections, then you are certainly engaging in anti-democratic practices, and it just ultimately becomes impossible for us to refuse. It's a real conundrum, and I obviously don't have a good solution, but I understand where it comes from.
Okay, let's over here, because you haven't had a question yet. And then I think this will be the last, or maybe one after that. Just one more follow. Here and there. Go ahead.
Okay. Kristen Cairns, International Rescue Committee. Alex, how do you see, stateside, how do you see the delay in the election results affecting the Obama administration's, the discussions on the Hill right now, as well as the timeline and the ultimate strategy? does that really impact the decision, or is it kind of, as you said at the beginning, something that's just an added, like a very, very poorly timed, but does it not really affect our decision? What do you think on that one?
First of all, let me say I love IRC. A lot of people that I have worked with over the many, many years in Afghanistan and Pakistan have at one time worked with IRC, and so they do terrific work. I think that the answer to the question is, unfortunately, it is having an impact. And that is because the level of doubt that has very suddenly erupted among the American population and the US Congress about our ability to do a good job in Afghanistan is being fed by this election crisis. It wasn't caused by it, but 8 months ago, we were not having this debate. Afghanistan was the good war. There was no serious debate in the presidential campaign about whether we should do more in Afghanistan. Both candidates said we're going to do more. Obama got elected. He immediately added more troops, added more money, put in a robust team, added Richard Holbrooke, put the embassy on steroids. I was in Kabul recently, and there's 6 ambassadors in our embassy now, headed by a former 4-star general. They fired their commander in theater, the first time they've done that in, something like 50 years, to put in the new hotshot, Patriots counterinsurgency superstar. Everything that, frankly, I have been asking for over the last 8 years and saying we're under-resourcing, you're not paying attention, they're delivering. In reality, they are putting all of these things into place. But that has come just at the moment when the American population, basically forgetting about Iraq and starting to pay attention to Afghanistan, has woken up and said, my God, like that congresswoman I mentioned at the beginning, my God, this place is a hellhole. What are we doing here? Troops are dying. Why are we even in Afghanistan? Can someone remind me? 9/11 was 8 years ago. Wasn't that about Iraq? I mean, there are so many things that have happened over the last 8 years that have distracted people from the importance of the region. And there's too many steps to the argument about why Afghanistan and Pakistan remain so central to our national interests. That the population suddenly looks at this in bewilderment, and frankly, because the Bush administration was saying for 7 years, oh, success, success, success. It wasn't until the last year of the Bush administration that they started to acknowledge that things weren't going badly. And so they woke up to something that they thought had been essentially solved, to find out that it's our worst foreign policy crisis. And so this election moment coming at this time is so perfectly fits into the, every conflict is Vietnam in Afghanistan, in the United States after Vietnam. Every single conflict that we've been engaged in, whether it was Panama or more aptly Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, are always compared to Vietnam. But Afghanistan is doing a pretty good job of making that comparison seem pretty salient when you have this president who's stealing elections, his brother's rumored to be a drug kingpin. And so I really do believe that this election crisis does feed into the debate, and by basically making it not a debate about sort of micro improvements in our strategy, to making it an entire debate about should we be there at all, should we be doing something else, should we be zapping someone from unmanned drones in the sky instead of having our troops on the ground. It's enabled the debate to expand, I think, very rapidly and into a dangerous territory.
Okay, do we have time for one more? No. Okay, I think we're going to close, and this has been really, really enlightening. I very much appreciate it. We all do. Your being here and giving us your insights. So, on behalf of the Rumi Forum, I'd like to just everybody clap again.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yes, thank you very much.